we ask questions not to assess learning. We ask questions to activate, advance, and augment our learning. And that's something he taught me.
Welcome, everybody. This podcast is all about you. Why knowledge matters. Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode. This time with Erik M. talking about his book, Inquiring Minds, published by Solution 3. Welcome, Erik M. to the show. Welcome back.
Thank you, Yannick. Thank you for having me. I had a great conversation with you last time and looking forward to continuing the conversations with you, this time about questioning and inquiry.
And it's also so beautiful because it's also a personal story, and you start the book with your father. Walk us a little bit through what he has been through and how influential he was on education and your career and what you're doing now, especially also your nature, right? Because you explain in the book that asking questions is not always easy, and actually you also face this when you were younger. So walk us through first and foremost about the story that is your father that you mentioned in the book, and then really about why you wrote Inquiring Minds in the first place.
Well, first of all, thank you for providing me the forum to share about my father. I'm very proud of him, not just only as his accomplishments, but just being the great dad that he was to me. And also grateful to Solution Tree to provide me the space in the book to share who my father was and what his accomplishments were and the impact he's had not only on me, but also others. So my father, his name's Frederick Francis, and he was one of the leaders, the unsung leaders of the American civil rights for the disabled movement that happened here in the 1970s in the States. He lost his legs in a car accident in 1965, uh, driving from Brooklyn, New York to Buffalo to go and visit his girlfriend who would become my mother, and he unfortunately got in a car accident and he damaged his legs enough that they had to be amputated. Now, this is 1965, and this is a whole different world and a whole different era in how people viewed people with disabilities and treated them and regarded them. So, my father, he was naturally a questioner. He's been a questioner even before he lost his legs his whole life. He questioned not only to challenge, but also because he was curious. He was a learner. He wasn't great at school. He was a good, okay student. Uh, he was smart. He was very intelligent, but we wouldn't call them kids like him. Now we would call them basically, intelligent, but not really motivated. So when he lost his legs in a car accident and he started realizing the limitations that were out there for him as a professional and a person, he became involved in the American civil rights movement for disabled. And he did this through questioning and inquiry, because one of the things that he did was he looked at the successes and the what was unsuccessful, what would be unsuccessful sometimes with the civil rights movement for African Americans, and looking at Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and all these different leaders. And he basically guided and supported a group that he found that was called So Fed Up. It's an acronym. It stands for something long. I don't remember the whole name of it. And then he got involved with the larger civil rights movement, and led a lot of peaceful protests, a lot of what we call passive resistance, a lot of what Gandhi did, a lot of what Martin Luther King did, uh, doing basically sit-ins. There's a whole thing. In fact, there's a documentary on Netflix. It's called Crip Camp. He's in it. He doesn't talk because Crip Camp was about the civil rights movement, how it started out of as a from enrollment in a summer camp for kids who were disabled. Or in the 1960s, it came from New York City, and he was not born disabled. He became disabled. But later in his career, he became a champion for disabled. Through this, he worked with vocational rehabilitation, most of his work in New York State. And what he did was he actually developed a workforce training program for people with the disabled. He was able to convince companies that this was an untapped workforce who that companies would benefit from because they had a loyal workforce. Now, a lot of times, unfortunately, a lot of companies are very narrow in their thinking, and they didn't see how. So my father got a grant that would pay for job coaches and transportation. So this grant would go and then pay for job coaches and transportation, but they would get this loyal workforce. And it started with the throughway system, the throughway stops in New York, which was owned by the Marriott Corporation. And then the Marriott Corporation said, "Well, what else do you have?" And my father said, "Well, what else do you need?" And they were talking about how they were getting a lot of lawsuits because people were losing their hearing in the laundry rooms. And my father said, "Well, why don't you just hire the deaf?" So see how he's using questioning and inquiry, and that's what led to my father being, successful. He wasn't celebrity status. There's a lot more other people out there, like Judy Heumann, who was actually a very close friend of the family, who really became the face behind a lot of the civil rights movement for disabled. But he was really a strong motivator and catalyst in it. He was one of the framers of the American Disabilities Act. The joke I like used to say is that when parents used to come in and say you're in violation of the American Civil Disabilities Act here in the states, I would say which part, and they'd say, well, you know it by heart, and I said, well, my father was one of the framers and writers of it. It was on a computer with a word perfect floppy disk right next to me, my in my room because I had the computer for school. So and then he retired, but he always championed the cause for the disabled, and really, he was a questioner. He questioned, like I said, not just the challenge, but because he was curious, and that's what made me a questioner because I was always asking why. I still ask why. I ask, why or how or what if. And what I realize is that when I ask questions, and sometimes we ask questions and people feel very, very on the defensive and off-putted because they think that they have to give an answer. We ask questions not to assess learning. We ask questions to activate, advance, and augment our learning. And that's something he taught me, and that's what made me a questioner as a learner because I would question everything. I mean, I'll give you examples throughout the show. It doesn't have to be solely academic. It could just be something pops in my mind, and I'll start asking questions and want to reflect and respond to them.
Yeah, that's beautiful and so important. It really is a really nice beginning for the book, and how important it is to ask question, and also how it somehow also gets transmitted, right? Because what we model, I mean, the really basic theory of learning is really observation and then modeling, right? And so it comes a long way, and especially also for parents in general, to really model that, ask questions, and even not be afraid to not be able to answer, but just ask question, and invite children especially to ask further question, and then do ultimately their own research, as you also mentioned in the book, right? There's so many now technologies, especially AI, and also Google and other softwares that really help to forge this inquiry, that we can really help students on their way, and not just students, but also I think we are, anyways, we are lifelong learners. We are always students to some extent, of course.
And that's
Now,
the why behind questioning. And I don't think we really get into the why as much as the how or the what. Um, and the why is hard to quantify because if you look at Simon Sinek's "Find Your Why, Start with Why," that is from your cerebral cortex. That's from your center of your brain. I think that's the part of it. I may be wrong, and if I am, I apologize. But that's another thing about questioning. You have to realize and accept you may be wrong, you may be right, like Billy Joel says. But why we ask questions and what that becomes a lot of times is because of a product of schooling. And that's what I talk about in the book is that if you we teachers, we do three things. We present information, we provide instructions, and we pose questions primarily for assessment. My thinking with questions and questioning and inquiry is why we ask the question is to activate learning or activate the brain or stimulate the brain, that inquiring mind, so that we can advance and augment our learning. If I ask you a question, I do not expect you or do not require you to have the answer. I'm informing you this is what you need to reflect before responding. That's why a lot of times I see things like where I see teachers say, well, I want my kids to ask deeper questions, or I want my kids to ask better questions. No, we just want our kids to ask questions. You know, we can't just paint the Sistine Chapel without first learning how to draw a stick figure. And that's okay. And if all you can do is draw that stick figure, okay, well, that may be the depth of your questioning. It's up to me as a teacher to try to prompt and stimulate you and stimulate your deeper thinking to ask a deeper question. Do I want to require you? No, because then that's about instruction. And that's okay, but we want questioning to be natural. And if you think about it, think about when you're with a child between the age of 2 and 5. All they do is ask questions. That's why I talk about in the book is that questioning is how adults and children communicate. And between the age of 2 and 5, that's how children communicate to adults. They ask questions. The biggest one is why. Okay, their creativity is what if or what else or what else could I do with it. When we go to school, two things happen. On a physiological, our frontal cortex develops to a point where our brain starts to slow down. And now we're not thinking in questions. Now we're thinking more in declaratives. That's why when in first grade, you have the student who says, I have a question. And the teacher says, well, what's your question? And they'll say, I went to McDonald's last night. That's not a question. Okay. Also, when we go to school, who's asking the questions and the purpose of the questions changes, because now you're not asking questions to activate and advance or augment your learning. Now you're primarily asking questions to assess learning. Is this everybody? No. Is it more of a larger generalization, more of the early majority and late majority and laggards? If you look at the theory of innovation with that, we're doing it. Yes. What I'm suggesting is that what we do is we ask questions to activate the learning. When I ask you a question, I am not just using that as an assessment, I am setting the instructional focus. And if I put the pronoun referring you in there, now what I'm doing is I'm personalizing your learning. It's not how is it done, why is it done? It's how do you, how can you, how could you? And we need to make questioning more of a comfortable yet a productive struggle and a creative frustration. And don't look at the word struggle and frustration, look at productive and look at creative, because everything starts with a question. What if we went to the moon? Okay. What if we could find the cure for cancer? What if there was a giant shark that terrorized a community that's known for summer vacations? How would the town respond to it? What if the sheriff of the town is afraid of the water? What if they bring in a sign? See what movie I'm making or what book I'm making here? That's the thing. Everything starts with a question, and we need to be curious enough and courageous enough not only to address and answer the question, but also ask the question.
But it also makes you an extremely nice conversionist to some extent, because I imagine, and just tell me how it is when I have a conversation with you, let's say in person, which is very different than online, right? And I think when you have this ability, especially if you develop this ability of asking good questions, whether there are such good or bad questions, and actually you also talk about this specifically in the book, but tell me a little bit how you usually converse with people, and how you really find like a good attunement to the other person, that you have somehow a fruitful discussion. So tell me a little bit your strategy, because I'm sure that you are extremely skilled in that. So walk us a little bit through about your reasoning and how you go into, and also how this book actually informs it, because you give very specific, very tangible strategies, especially also for teachers, how to actually frame questions, to make it personalizable for the students, right? and not just we, but also specific to yourself. So give us a little bit of taste about how you conduct, let's say with your very best friend, a
Y-
beautiful conversation, and how
Okay.
this book actually, Inquiring Minds, applies to that.
I'm going to say this, yeah, and I'm going to paraphrase John Hattie as I always do. Everything works, but everything doesn't work for everybody. Okay. I have specific things I do in terms of not only my professional, my personal conversations. Okay. That was questioning. Now, does it work with everybody? No, it really depends upon the person. One of my big things that I say, what do you mean? And every time you give me an answer, I say, what do you mean? Now, some people see that as what I intended to be, which is the engagement of a conversation or the request for an explanation. Some people say they're offended. They get bothered. Again, it's the type of personality you're dealing with. Like if I said to you, who's the first president of the United States? Most people say George Washington. And I say, what do you mean? That kind of puts them off sometimes. All right. Or if somebody wants to, it's really interesting how I also use it because sometimes people try to challenge you, unfortunately, and try to make you look bad or try to make you look like they're a fool, you're a fool, and they're smarter than you. So I'll say to them, they'll make a comment and say, "What do you mean?" And it's really funny because some people go, well, what do you mean? What do I mean? And I go, exactly. What do you mean? I'd like to know what are you saying here? What are you meaning here? Or there's actually times now when I do trainings where people will say, and I'll talk about something and they'll go, what do you mean? Or I'll ask them a question and I'll go, what do you mean? And I'll go, the Padawan has become the Jedi. Awesome. Now you got it. Okay. But Yannick, there's also a thing where, and this is another thing I take a lot, and it's actually I'm writing about this in my next book because I'm working on my next book right now. I really have taken to the concept of rethinking, and this was something that was introduced to me in the book Think Again by Adam Grant. And the whole concept of rethinking is that basically there's new data and information and changing circumstances and conditions that cause and compel us to rethink. Now, in our everyday, that's very easy. If we want to rethink our wardrobe, we'll do that. If we want to rethink renovating our house or renovating, or getting a new car or upgrading our technology, we'll rethink about why we do, how we do what we do. But when it comes to our knowledge, understanding, and feelings, we struggle because we find comfort in our convictions. We accept our knowledge and understanding as truth. Our ideas become ideology. In fact, that's one of the things Einstein felt very resentful about and very concerned about because he became the thing he stood against, which was when science becomes ideology and not a questioning of ideas. Now people are like, "Oh, I agree with Einstein," or "I am a part of the Einstein camp." That limits and that basically limits our learning. So again, with that rethinking, I've listened to some people who've said to me, "I don't like what do you mean?" And some people will say, "Can I say how do you know?" And I don't like that because now it doesn't sound like to me I'm having a conversation. Now it sounds like to me like I'm challenging you. I'm throwing down the gauntlet. I'm confronting you or tell me more. But at the same time, I can't just say you're wrong because they're not. I think they're wrong, but wrong is part of a thought concept. I didn't think we were gonna get that deep of conversation. So one of the things I'm doing right now, and I'm really trying to push is with the concept of rethinking, is from more of a positive aspect to say, you're right, but why? So if I asked you what is 2 plus 2, you would say to me,
For
you're right, but why? And that why is what's really essential. It's not that 2 plus 2 equals 4. You can do that on your calculator. You can Google it. ChatGPT can even tell you about it. Can you explain to me how addition can be used to find the sum of two numbers such as 2 plus 2? That's the transferable learning. Now, what if you're not correct? Okay. Or what if you may be wrong? Okay. How do I do that without me saying to you, doing the Alex Trebek where I used to call it, where I go, ooh, I'm sorry. So now what I'm doing, I'm quoting Billy Joel. You may be wrong, but you may be right. But why? So that's the whole thing is that basically how we communicate. So that's two strategies. So whenever a child gives you an answer, ask, what do you mean? If you feel that might be um, not go over as well in your class, then say, you're right, but why? Or if they're incorrect, how about this? Or they're wrong. Okay, you may be wrong, but you may be right, but why? So quoting Billy Joel. So that's another technique that I actually came up with. It's not in the book. So again, but that's that rethinking, Yannick. I mean, when you read my book, Inquiring Minds Want to Learn, what I wrote in there is a snapshot of my thinking at that time, but that's not Canaan law of education. That's not, shouldn't be taken as this. There's always new things to think about. The reason why I wrote Inquiring Minds Want to Learn is because you see now that's a good question over my shoulder. That was my first book and was about the different types of questions we can ask and talk about how to create them. I wrote that in 2016, and I'm very grateful that it still works for people. People still enjoy it, but that was over 8 years ago. There's new data and information about questioning and inquiry, how we use questions. And 8 years ago, we didn't have a pandemic. 8 years ago, the world did not have Chat GPT that could explain to us the answers. So that's why I wrote this book as more of an updated to say this is it and moving forward. And one of the things I try to do with my book is I try to say all my books is that this is not a snapshot in time. This is not, this works today, but tomorrow it won't work, and then we'll find it on the half price bookshelf because it's outdated. I try to make the ideas timeless with it. So again, what I'm hopefully not only doing is giving you some credible techniques, but also showing you the mindset of learning with questioning and inquiry. It involves asking people to rethink the data information. It's asking them to rethink and reflect on or review the circumstances and conditions, and asking them to reconsider based upon that why we do, how we do, what we do. It's not about answering, it's about addressing. So when I ask you a question, I don't expect you to answer, but this is what we're going to address. To get you to communicate, to delve deeper, to get you to go further, I will ask, what do you mean? I am now asking, you're right, but why? Or you may be wrong, you may be right, but why? And when I'm lecturing, and I just did this in Singapore, instead of me telling you, because right now I'm talking a lot, and Yannick, as much as it's deep, people get tuned out if we talk too much, and if we lecture, and if we pontificate, and if we sermonize. But one of the techniques, and I do this in my instructional delivery, is I say, what if I told you? And then I share with them the information I would have lectured. So I did this in Singapore, which was really fascinating because a lot of times in Singapore, questioning inquiry is still very directive and instructional from a generalized standpoint. We want to teach and learn with questions and use questioning. You teach and learn through what I say is teach and learn through inquiry by questioning with good questions. So that requires changing your instructional delivery. So instead of me saying the Pythagorean theorem is a squared plus b squared equals c squared because it's half a square, I would say, what if I told you the Pythagorean theorem is a squared plus b squared equals c squared because it's the algorithm formula that describes half a square? You see how I'm inviting you into the conversation? Instead of telling you Edgar Allan Poe created an entire genre of literary fiction by writing the first detective story featuring a sleuth who used deductive logic and reasoning to solve a crime. Okay, great. Probably tuned me out after the first few words after I said Edgar Allan Poe or first detective mystery story or first genre of literature. But if I said, what if I told you that Edgar Allan Poe created an entire genre of literary fiction? Now I'm inviting you in. Now I'm drawing in. What if I told you he was the first to ever write a detective mystery story featuring a sleuth or a detective who used deductive logic and reasoning to solve a crime? Who does that sound like? Most kids would say Sherlock Holmes. Well, what if I told you that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle actually admitted that he based Sherlock Holmes on a character Edgar Allan Poe created 60 years before, named C. Auguste Dupin, in the short story Murders in the Rue Morgue? What if I told you that's not in your textbook? But what if I told you we're going to read it? See how I got you now? Okay. That's the whole thing about questioning. What did you learn? A lot. What did I teach you? Absolutely nothing. I just asked a question. But part of learning is not just demonstrating your learning, it's comprehending, communicating, and considering. So that's what I'm having you do. So that's the important thing about questions. So again, quick strategies. Anytime a child gives you the answer, you ask, what do you mean? If they feel uncomfortable with that, use this. Hey, you're right, but why? Or if they're incorrect or wrong, all right, you may be wrong, but you may be right, but why? Okay. And then instead of lecturing, say, what if I told you? And give them the information. And then you have the kids talk amongst themselves and you walk the room and you listen. And once they're starting the conversation start to trail off, you bring it back with a countdown of 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And you ask them, what is something someone told you? Because now they have to summarize it.
And I mean, it sounds really, really crucial. So, what do you think is the biggest challenge for especially teachers and professionals to actually implement that? Where do you think is the gap from theory to actually doing it in terms of the resources and so on?
So one of the things I will say when I get things I get back most is time. When do I have time to do this? I have so many standards I have to go through. The curriculum says, the curriculum map says we need to be done. When do I have time to ask questions? Okay. Or ask these type of questions. That's one thing. The other thing I often get pushback on is what if the kids don't answer? Okay. What if the kids don't respond? Look, they're not going to, most likely, because they've been taught not to. Okay. This whole thing of time on task. Okay. When somebody said to me, does anyone have any questions? When my teacher asked me, does anyone have any questions? To me, that was show and tell because I had a lot of questions. So I'll be in English language arts and say, yeah, why do I get a chill going down my spine when Dave walks behind me? Eric, stay on task. Okay, but you ask any questions. Okay. And it got to the point where actually some of my teachers even said, does anyone have any questions about the topic, Eric? Okay. That's the other thing. Um, so you have to be courageous and confident enough to accept and enjoy the silence. And you have to basically recognize and realize that people are not going to answer. They don't want to be wrong. They don't want to be right. They don't want to be put in the spotlight. And if you think it's just kids, you should see a professional development when I ask questions. Not everybody is volunteering. And more often than not, the person who's speaking the most and volunteering, they're getting the dirty looks or the glares or the scowls because they're like, oh, I just want to listen, learn, and move on. Okay. So that's another thing, the confidence and courage of it. And I was just about to say that questioning demands a lot, not of critical thinking, but creativity. Okay. It takes a lot of creativity to come up with what I call that good question, that compelling question. It doesn't have to be, you know, a deep question. I mean, I can take a a question that has a single response, a factual question, and it's not the question I ask, it's what I do with the question. I like to quote Eric Clapton, it's in the way that you use it. So again, if I say, what is 2 plus 2? You say 4, then I say, you're right, but why? If I say, who's the first president? And you say, George Washington, you're right, but why? Or what do you mean? Okay, because it's the way you use the question. The other thing we need to realize is that the quote questions we often get in our textbooks and on tests are not good questions in terms of what it does for the student, not only to assess, but also activate, advance, and augment their learning. It is an item or an activity students must complete more often than not as an interrogative statement. Okay. Questioning and the same thing with the Socratic method. And sometimes, some people are gonna, gasp and click their tongues. But I'm gonna tell you right now, Socrates did not put people in an inner circle, put people in an outer circle and say, you can talk and converse, you're the recorder, you're this, and give them a sign, and made this controlled inquiry, like I call, or structured inquiry, I call, or guided inquiry. Socrates, you should just walk in the Colosseum or walk wherever he was and ask a question and just let the class work it out, or let the group work it out, or let his students work it out with themselves. That is true Socratic questioning. So, again, number one, it's understanding that questioning is uncomfortable, not only for the person who's being asked the question, but the person who's asking it. And you have to be confident and courageous enough not only to ask the question, but also accept and enjoy the silence. Number two, you need to be a real creative thinker. And that does not happen overnight. This is a talent. Questioning is a talent as well as a gift and a skill. And when I say gift, that's not always a blessing. That's sometimes a curse, because you can be cursed as a questioner, because you're always asking questions and people just go, because that's how it is. No, nothing is how it is. Okay. And the other thing is just basically be willing to ask that question, and be okay with the fact that some people don't know, and that's okay, and communicate that.
You also mentioned, critical, reflective, but also creative. You know, that's what you need in order
Hmm.
to have an inquiring mind. So walk us through these three important components and what you specifically mean.
You know, Einstein said this, and there was a Greek philosopher, I think it was Euripides, who said this. He said, uh, Euripides said, question everything. I may be incorrect about the person, again, admitting you're wrong. Question everything, learn something, answer nothing. And that's the big thing about having an inquiring mind. It's not about the answers. Answers come free. We live in a world where we can get our answers off the computer, or we can get our answers off the cell phone. If I can use a calculator with it, okay, I can get the answer. Chat GPT, the reason why people are scared of AI is because AI is now explaining the answer in a way that is in a language that's understandable. Like, you can tell ChatGPT explain quantum theory to a kindergartner, and it'll say quantum theory is a study of tiny, tiny things and how tiny, tiny things move to tiny, tiny places. Okay, that's how a kindergartner would understand quantum theory. It is something that basically it is at your core of curiosity. Let me give you an example. It could be anything. All right. In the book, I talk about how my inquiring mind was triggered by COVID, and there's a list of questions there. I'm like, okay, well, what is coronavirus? Why is it called COVID-19? What was COVID 1 through 18? What's a pandemic? What's the difference between a pandemic and an epidemic? Has there ever been pandemics throughout history? How do we handle those pandemics? So that's the big thing with that. And also, it just comes out of nowhere. I'll give you an example. My daughters and I, we did a listening party. They'd had a listening party with me with Taylor Swift's new album. And she's a good musician, but I also really wanted to concentrate on the lyrics. And I'm looking at those lyrics, and I'm asking my daughters, what did she mean by that? Why is she saying this? Why does she feel like she needs to swear so much? Because she does swear a lot in it. So here's what happened. I'm going out on Sunday. I'm driving in my car, and Bruce Springsteen's "Hungry Heart" comes on. And I love music, but I also love listening to the lyrics. And it was on a shuffle on my Apple iTunes. And next was Bon Jovi's "You Give Love a Bad Name." And I'm listening to the lyrics. And I'm like, there's a similarity in tone and effect and structure of these lyrics that Springsteen sang and Bon Jovi sang and Taylor Swift is singing. So, what is the similarities in the underlying tone, effect, and meaning of these songs? And my question is Taylor Swift basically have the same kind of songwriting merit, or credence, or focus as Bruce Springsteen and Bon Jovi? And you say Bruce Springsteen and Bon Jovi because they're the legends, and now you got Taylor Swift, who's emerging as it. But see, but no one really think about that, and that's what it means to have an inquiring mind. Now, that doesn't mean that's who you have to be. That's my inquiring mind. That was my father's inquiring mind. You could have just acquiring mind just be naturally curious. Pay attention to life, pay attention to what people say or why they say it. And I think that's important in this day and age, especially with AI and how information and ideas and issues just we're rapidly and regularly bombarded with it. We have to shift through, the flotsam and the jetsam and ask why. And sometimes it's an uncomfortable situation where when I taught history, I used to have that student came in all the time. Mr. Francis, did you know that Adolf Hitler was Times Man of the Year? Yep. Okay, well, how'd that happen? Well, circumstance and conditions. Okay. Well, can we talk about that? Okay, now you're in that zone because now you're not talking about what's in the curriculum. So let's see how we can tie. Okay, I would have the kids. Why was Adolf Hitler named Times Man of the Year? And should that designation been taken away, or was it deserved based upon what he did? Now that's a very open question. And if you notice, I'm not taking a position. And that's where some of our teachers get in trouble. We take positions, we give our opinions. It's not what we think, it's only what we know and understand and can prove. Okay. We don't want to control minds, we want to shape and mold minds. I don't want them to think like the way I think. I want them to think for themselves and be able to have a conversation with me. But by asking that question, there's no correct answer. There's a right and wrong. Because if you look at the arguments, people would say, yeah, he deserved it because he brought Germany back and reunited it from bankruptcy. But, and that's why he should deserve it. But should it be taken away? Yeah, you're right, because of what he ended up doing in the abuse of power. See, that's the thing. So you're not defending him, you're defending the fact that he was given his designation. And should the designation be taken away, and then you can have the kids explore other things like should Pete Rose not be in the Hall of Fame because of what he did? Should OJ Simpson had the Heisman kept the Heisman trophy or have his designation because of what he did? Should and that way you're not having a position about the person, you're having a position about the issue, and you're also not cementing a position. Now my personal feelings, I'm not as I don't want to share because that's what happens and what causes us to basically create divisions. If you ask me what's my opinion, I'll talk to you in person one on one, but it's not for me to share in a public forum. That's the way sometimes I look at it, unless the focus is on that.
What are one of the most prevalent question that come again and again up in your mind?
Why, how, what if, what else, and what else can I do? Okay, my books are always about it always asks a question. Now that's a good question asked. How can we clarify what an essential question is? Because there's so many different things about essential questions. So I'm going to call them good questions. And I'm going to say good questions are essential questions. You know, um, depth of knowledge. Okay. This is inaccurate. Why? This DOK wheel is inaccurate. Why? It was a deep dive into it. Um, Now it's to a point where I can just great and say, hey, look, here's new data and information. Norman Webb said this. Now that's what we need to rethink. You need to decide to reconsider. Um, Basically, those are the big questions. This one, Inquiring Minds want to learn. How can we change questioning? My next book is about rethinking some other aspects in education. The thing is, again, is that the danger is you don't want your ideas to become ideology. That's what makes you not only a great learner but a great teacher. It's like it's kind of like paraphrase Tom Cruise and A Few Good Men. It's not what I think or feel, it's what I can improve or what I can share. And again, like I said, like I talked about some controversial subjects, and if you said, hey Eric, what's your opinion on it? Okay, you've given me permission to share my opinion. Okay, now my personal opinion is, yeah, I do think he should have gotten the Man of the Year taken away. I do think OJ Simpson should have gotten the Heisman Trophy. I think he did. Or Pete Rose, I don't think he should be barred from the Hall of Fame. But now that's not about the issue. Now it's about the individual. See, that's the whole thing. That and I actually felt like I had to say that because we are also living in a day and age where anything we say and do can and will be misinterpreted and misrepresented. I mean, especially to our school boards. Like I could say, hey, I can walk on water, and people will say, well, Eric claimed he can't swim. See, so that's the whole thing. And I can't tell you how much stuff gets twisted, but that's why we need to ask questions. If somebody said to me something where I was teaching and they said, Eric, you said this, or Eric, that's what you mean. I'd say, what do you mean? Well, Eric, that's what I heard. Oh, see how now I opened a conversation? So that's the whole thing, is that we really need to use questioning. And that's the other thing. Like, okay, so what's the story behind that? Or why are they saying this? Why are they levying this accusation? Why are they making why are they expressing this opinion? Is it from examples or emotions? And what are they using as their evidence? That's the whole thing. So the big question, I guess, what I always ask is, you know, I mean, I ask all the questions. I ask what, who, what, where, and when. Those are good questions, because it gives me the knowledge, acquire the knowledge, DOK one. How and why can make me do a DOK one or DOK two, depending whether I got to attain it or explain it. How and why could, or what if. Now I have to think strategically, or I have to analyze the knowledge I have or the knowledge it's given. It's DOK3. Or what else, or how else, or what else can I do, or how else I can do. It's a DOK4. So really, the one questions I don't want to ask are questions I can answer with yes or no, because at the end of the conversation of cognition. Dichotomous questions, true, false, you know. Um, Leading questions, which is, excuse me, which are, you did this, didn't you? Lawyers do that. Or loaded questions where I'm swaying you to think. Like if I say to you, should the death penalty be abolished? That's a loaded question, because I'm basically loading it to say that's what I want you to focus on. The way to make that a good question is say, should the death penalty be abolished, legally permitted, or depends on the situation? Now I have options to consider. So
How did you prepare for this whole book? Of course, you already wrote the book, you know how to ask good questions. But how did this Inquiring Minds make you do more work and more in-depth work in terms of posing the question? How did it differ between your first book of questioning and the one that you wrote now and that just came out actually this month, published by Solution Tree?
So now that's a good question. Identify the different questions we could ask our students. It's more so like, what are the different questions? This one is more about, how do I understand and use good questions to teach and learn through inquiry and by questioning? And what really is interesting, and this happens a lot when you write a book, it's that the book is what you wrote, but the way you present it and teach it becomes a little bit different. So Inquiring Minds Wants to Learn was came out of a natural outgrowth of, now that's a good question. Now that's a good question. If you just want to know what are the different questions are, and what they do, that's what the good questions do. That's a good question. It's got what I call the cognitive rigor questions framework, based on the concept of cognitive rigor developed by Karen Hess. What's the level of thinking and depth of knowledge demanded? That's a good one to say, okay, I want to ask these type of questions. Inquiring Minds Wants to Learn is more of a process and how you understand and use the good questions to teach and learn through inquiry and by questioning. So, in Inquiring Minds Wants to Learn, I identify 7 forms of inquiry we can engage in experience. There's traditional forms of what we call controlled or confirmation, structured, guided, open, free, that was established by Joseph Schwab in the 60s and cemented by Marshall Heron in the 70s. Okay. And those are the ones that traditionally in education, and you're in Canada, and a lot of your inquiry standards are based upon the 4 core of what I call the 4 core of inquiry, of controlled confirmation, which is completely teacher led, um, structured inquiry, which is teacher led, but the outcomes become student centered, guided inquiry, which is and starts as teacher led, but slowly becomes more student centered, and open free inquiry, which is where the teacher just kind of starts you off, and then everything's driven by the students. Since then, in the 2000s, there's been three other forms of inquiry I found. One was called coupled inquiry, and that's a combination of guided and open inquiry, and that's how you would basically be more student responsive in terms of your instruction, where the teacher would step in when the student needs it, more of an RTI method. That's why it's a balance of coupled and open free inquiry, guided and open free inquiry. Authentic inquiry is really what it is. It's just what it says, where, hey, what do you want to learn? And it was really funny because that was a lot of what happened with the open classroom movement in the 60s. It's like, okay, what do you want to learn in school today? You know, what's driving you, man? What's stimulating you, man? That's authentic inquiry. Synergistic inquiry, which came out in 2019, that is a new form where it's more collaborative, where the teacher is actually participating, not as the leader, but or the facilitator, but actually participating in the inquiry experience. So that's like when you have student government classes, or you have more of, a collaborative where the teacher is not just the leader, they are the member of the team. That's really good in terms of the form of inquiry for that. So that's how it starts off with the seven forms of inquiry. And then I created a thing that extended out. Now that's a good question. I call the Inquiring Minds framework. And that's what the book really delves into. So the idea is you develop and deliver your instruction with good questions. So you pique their interest or hook them with a good question. Like I can walk in the classroom and just ask a question. So how can we use linear equations to create football plays? Now I hooked you. Okay. Now, depending upon the intent and purpose of the teaching and learning experience, I'll go down four different pathways. And that depends upon the demand of the standard and the strength of the students and the needs of the experience. So, foundational is building foundational knowledge, in which you use your students' questions of what they don't know and understand, how they express it as a question. You use their questions to build background knowledge and functional understanding. The pathway of understanding is standards driven, where you turn your standards into a question. Standards are not questions. The question can be hidden in it, embedded in it, but it's an objective, it's an imperative statement. Deep goes beyond the standard. That's where you really get into critical and creative inquiry and questioning, because both the teacher and the student really have to think critically and creatively about what can be done with what they've learned. That's more of a deeper dive. This is where you're doing with your important standards or nice to know. Expertise. Here's the simplest way to make a good question for expertise. Take your objective, take your standard. It's written as an imperative statement, and you put one or three question stems in front of it. How do you? That's assessment. So I'm asking you, how do you do something? How can you is instruction. So instead of saying I can fluently multiply multi-digit numbers using a standard algorithm, or I can explain the function of a cell and the way the parts just contribute to its function, now I'm saying how can you fluently multiply multi-digit numbers using an algorithm, or how can you explain the function of the cell and the way the parts um, contribute to its function? Now I have my instructional focus, my invitational learning. How could you? Prompts and encourages inquiry. And that's my favorite. And I try not to say it's my favorite, because then I sway people's thinking. And some people say, well, can't you say how could you for assessment and instruction too? I say, yes, because that's the discovery of learning. So that's really what the core is. The core is identifying what it means to have an inquiring mind, or what is teaching and learning with inquiring mind involved. Then it talks about the seven forms of inquiry we can engage in experience. And it expands upon the four core of that was developed back in the 1670s by Schwab and Heron. And then it goes into how do I use the inquiring minds framework to teach and learn with inquiring mind through inquiry and by questioning with good questions. And it will teach you not only how to plan your instruction, but also provide your instruction, and how to pose your questions. The interesting chapter is the one on deep inquiry, because that's where I teach teachers how to go on ChatGPT, or tell them how to go on OpenAI and come up with the questions that the kids can address. But use AI not as a source. Don't use AI and say, oh, I typed in what's a good DOK3 question they can address. Okay. You need to use it as stimulus, not as source. You still need to vet that question. And that's the danger. Don't trust the tech. Still use your instructional talent to think critically and creatively. Okay, is that really a DOK3? Is that really a good question? Can I come up with a better question? That's the whole thing. And that's why I always say be careful when it comes to these programs out there that say, we have a DOK question generator. Okay, first of all, most of the stuff that comes off it are not questions, they're objectives, phrases, imperative statements. Secondly, who is vetting the DOK level? How do I know? I can't just trust the technique. I can't just trust the tech, excuse me, that to say that that's at that level demanded, or that it's even addressing the standard at the level demanded.
This is a really fascinating book, and I love it because it helps you in your instruction, in your worksheets, in everything. You can really just tap into it and with the reproducible. So it's a really incredible source for me as a teacher and for whatever you do in your life when you somehow are developing resources for people to learn and strive. And so I really recommend it. I already started actually reframing certain of my tasks, and really instruction, the way I instruct and so on, because it really gives an incredible uh, framework in which I can really kind of help students to find their own way. But obviously, it needs to be structured, especially if they're still young. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that's one of the big challenges today is not so much that we don't have information, but that we do usually don't have the structure, right? We get lost of
Mm-hmm.
so many things out there. There's so many bling blings, right? It's and this applies to any area of life, and this book really helps incredible in further your personal and professional development, and then ultimately to make a big and huge impact on students,
Thank,
including
thank
their
you for saying
parents.
that.
And so the last question is really why, what's your view, why teachers, districts leader or whatever should buy the book, the single most important aspect why they should buy it.
Let's talk about why we should do what the book suggests. Okay, the buying the book is the what, and the how is what's in the book, but the why is the reasoning behind it is that basically the reasoning is we really want our kids to learn, and we really want to create different ways we can measure learning. That's the reasoning behind it. you know we are measured and we are judged a lot of times by standardized or formalized assessments that are a snapshot. That standardized assessment you took that day or over the course of a week tells me not so much even what you know and understand, but also how you feel in that week. What if that's the week your parents got divorced, or what if that's the week somebody died, your parents got evicted, or you broke up with your boyfriend or girlfriend, and you're just not feeling well, you're sick, or you're having something traumatic happen in your life. Questioning and communicating, not answering, questioning and addressing, communicating is a true measure of learning. And we need to use questions. And my why with questioning is that so we can communicate with each other. And I think we've lost the art of communication. We've lost, someone, I read somewhere, someone said we're more connected now than ever, but we're communicating with each other so much more, so much less. When I was about to say that, if you ever know the book Brave New World by Aldous Huxley, is that part of the thing about it, which is the opposite of 1984 George Orwell, is that we are living in a world where there's so much information that we don't know what the truth is, and we don't care because it's just so much out there. We don't want to take the time and effort. We're more focused on what Huxley called the orgy porgy, and we're all sedated with the soma. And a lot of it is that we just accept things as they are, and we get our news, or is it now in 24-hour cycles, and a lot of times it comes out. It's more not so much about credible information. It's more about let's throw this against the wall and see if it sticks, and let's throw it before my competitor throws it. But that might be the last thing we heard, you know? So that's the reason why I I wrote this book, and I'm asking people to take a look at it, or take a look at my work, or reach out to me and connect with me, because I'm going to ask you to rethink why you use questions, how you use questions, and what questions are for. That's the big thing. Um, and again, forums like this, Yannick, I really am grateful for it because it allows us to talk. I mean, if you'd like to buy the book, I appreciate it. But before you buy that book, I'm going to ask you to rethink why you use, how you use, and what you do with questions. The book is your action to reconsider. Okay. I'm just asking you, this book is about, rethinking what inquiring minds want and what is teaching and learning with an inquiring mind involved. The how is there's a bunch of different strategies in there, and the what will be you will walk away not only understanding how to teach and learn with inquiring mind, but also learn and live and lead on your own with inquiring mind. So I think that's the big thing. I mean, you never want to sell it, you want to share it. And that's the thing. So here's my question to you. Are you ready to rethink why you use, how you use, and what you do with questions? And are you willing to reconsider why you ask questions, how you use questions, and what you do with your questions to teach and learn? If you are, then I recommend my book. There's other books out there that are great on inquiry, but this one will talk about how to teach and learn with an inquiring mind, and how to teach and learn through inquiry and by questioning with good questions.
And every great endeavor starts with a question. So, therefore, I think for everyone, just get your copy on www.solutiontree.com or .ca and grab a beautiful copy of Inquiring Minds by Erik M. Francis. Thank you so much for being on the show, Mr. Francis. Always a pleasure, and I truly relished your book, and it will be a constant guidance for me in order to improve my personal and personal practice. Thank you so much. Truly a blessing.
Yannick, thank you. And thank you for having another conversation. It's the second time we've talked, and you run a great podcast. And thank you for allowing me this forum. And I hope we will have continuous conversations in the future. And please feel free to reach out whenever you want.
Wonderful. I'm sure I will do this because I can't wait for having future conversation with you. Erik M. Francis. That's why knowledge matters. Make your life a masterpiece. Visit now programs.d-ykm.com. Meant to make you